Now for today, today we need a chumash, and we'll have to learn the Seder Apsukim and see how they reflect on the Seder Havoda. There's going to be a problem. But before we get to that, let's just talk a little bit more about chafina. In the case of the Ketores, we said that there was a chafina outside in the Azara when the Kohen put his hands to scoop up the Ketores from the second machta and then placed the Ketores into the kaf. Now he takes the kaf into the Kodesh Kodshim and he places the machta, the first machta that has the gecholim in it, that he brought from the Roved Aravi of the Azor. He placed it down Bein Abadim in the Kodesh Kodshim. And now he's holding on to the kaf, and he has to do a chafina, a second chafina from the kaf to place the ketores on the gecholim in the machta that's on the ground between the Bein Abadim. And Rashi in Masechta Yoma on Daf Mem Tesam and Beis has a unique approach to how exactly he accomplishes this goal. And the subject is Ofen Chafina Zu. What was the methodology of this second chafina? Now you may recall that we mentioned yesterday, the Tosas Shita is that this second chafina is not doraisa. It's not an absolute critical requirement. It's a drabana. But on the other hand, Tosa Rosh insisted that it's doraisa, derived from the pasuk umila chafnav ktores samim daka vehevi mi beis laparoches. So let's open up the Chumash in Perek Zayin pasuk Yud Beis, and it says v'lakach malo amachata gachalei eish me'al mizbech milufnei Hashem umalo chafnav ktores samim daka vehevi mi beis laparoches. Now the question is, how do we interpret these words, umalo chafnav ktores? It would seem, at first glance, that this pasuk is commanding the first chafina that was done outside the Kodshim Kodshim, in the Azara, and then vehevi means that he brought it into the Kodesh Kodshim. However, the Tosas Yeshanim points out, in order to explain the Tosa Rosh, that this chafina that's indicated here in the pasuk, Malo Chafnav Ketores, is not referring to the first chafina outside the Kodesh Kadosh, but rather to the second chafina, to teach us min Torah that the requirement of a second chafina. Lefi shemeikar adin haylo lahavi aktoris likodesh kadoshim bechafnav, that technically we should have required that he bring the Ketores into the Kodesh Kadoshim in his hands, that he's carrying it in the Moloch Hafnayim, without any kli. Because when it says Vehevi, the word Vehevi is going back on Moloch Hafnav. So we should have completely obviated the kli, meaning the kaf, if we take this pasuk literally. So he should bring the below chafna. But that's impossible. Why? I mean, if he's using both his hands to carry the Ketores, he doesn't have a third hand to carry the machta with the gecholim in it, which we said before. That was our discussion the day before, that he carries the machta with the gecholim in his right hand and the kaf with the Ketores in his left hand. So efshar baktoras aktores In other words, he could have, because completely, again, in a conceptual world, he could have completely circumvented the need for the kaf, if we take this pasuk literally, that it goes from Melo Chafna Vehevi. So then, since in reality, he cannot possibly bring it from Melo Chafna into the Kodesh Kodshim without a kli, then what are we going to do with this pasuk, Melo Chafna Vehevi? And the Tosa Rosh interprets that we have to reinterpret this pasuk that Melo Chafna Vehevi is inside the Kodesh Kodashim, and Vehevi means to bring the Torres that he's carrying in his hands and place it on top of the Machta with the Gechol. In any event, this second Melo Chafnaim is Minat Torah. So Rashi says, how does he accomplish this second Melo Chafnaim, which, according to the sheet of the Tosa Rosh, is Doraisa? And we can possibly assume that Rashi agrees Tosa Rosh is Doraisa. Yidei Oches es Hayad es Yadakaf b'Roshei Etzbosov u'Moshech es Yada l'Kivun Gufo. So he grabs onto the kaf with his two longer fingers, and he brings it closer to his body until the handle of the kaf is between Bein Shnei Marpakov, which I think he means that he, I don't know what word to use, he lifts up his arm such that his elbow is now almost connected to the forearm or the upper arm, and he's now got the handle, the yad of the kaf, stuck in his underarm. He gives another alternative that he's actually biting it with his teeth. And now at this point, he's able to tip over the kaf such that the contents of the kaf, meaning the Ketores, now falls into his two hands. Umoshech es yada l'kivun gufo ashi hayad. Yad means the handle of the kaf. Lebein shnei marpakov. V'akaf atzma nimtza b'rosh shtei kapos yadav ha'ochsim zeh b'zeh. So now, if he's able to hold the top of the handle of the kaf in that elbow, somewhere in the elbow, so now he can stretch out his arms and hold on to the kaf with both his hands. And then mates hakaf, holding on to the kaf itself, not the handle, he can tip it over litzida, ma'at, very gradually, ad shemamale kol chafna victoris. So it's interesting. He's using a different part of his body to tip over the kaf, which now will allow the ketores to go into his two hands. Very complicated. And that's why we said yesterday, this is one of the most, there's another case called Malika B'chat Sa'of, but this is a very complicated and challenging avod. All right. Now, we have a machlokes Tanoim recorded in a Bryce in Yom Adafnun Beis Amid Beis. And that machlokes revolves around the following question. Which part of the machta does he begin with? In other words, when he's placing the ketores on the gecholim in the machta, there's part of the machta that is closer to the bein abadim, closer to the Aron, and there's part of the machta that we'll call the chitzoni. That's the outer section of the machta. And according to one Tana Maskil, es nesinas haktoris bitzidah hapnimi shel hamachta, the inner side of the machta, which is the rosh hamachta shepnima li aron, which is closer to the aron abris. And then vitzover v'holach likivun sidah chitoni, so he gradually drops the ktores from the inner gecholim to the outer gecholim in the machta, and he gets to the Rosh HaMachta HaChitzoni HaSomach Legufa. In other words, the Machta is on the ground, Bein Abadim, and he's on the outside. So that if he puts the Ktores on the Pnimi first, and then he goes L'Kivun HaChitzoni, he's gradually coming towards the head of the Machta in the Chitzoni side, which is closer to him. Asamach legufa. Oh, here's the second sheet in the Tanoim. Maskil b'tzidah chitzoni. He starts pouring the ktoris on his side of the machta. That's the chitzoni side. V'tzorver v'holich l'tzidah pnimi. And then he moves towards the inside. And the Gemara comes to the maskana la'alacha that we hold that he starts with the pnimi and then moves towards the chitzoni, gradually moving towards himself. Why? Im yaskil b'tzida chitzoni, we have a security issue. If he begins to place the gecholim, to place the ktoris on the chitzoni side, which is closer to his body, then he's going to. So the fire is rising from the ktoris that's burning. He's going to have to lean over this fire in order to apply the ktoris in the pnimi side. And therefore, his hands might get burned mina oshan shalak ktoris, from the smoke rising from the ktoris. So if he starts from the inner side, then it's away from his body, and gradually, the fire shoots up closer and closer to his body, and he has that arm's length difference. We don't have to worry about his burning. And this is another example where the Avodas Yom Kippurim is determined by health reasons. Okay. Now we get to the point of the Kiyum mitzvah, the final culmination of this mitzvah, and that's called Male Oshan. So there's a Timores, and the Timores is a smoke pillar, a pillar of smoke, that goes lamala, goes straight up, like he compares to makel zakuf, like a staff that's vertical. Uliachar mikan hoya oshan mispazer min atikra. So when the smoke of this pillar hits the ceiling of the Kodesh Kodashim, it now spreads lechol halal Kodesh Kodashim, to the point at which the smoke, the room of the Kodesh Kodashim, is smoke filled. And Mishanis Mali Abayis Kule Oshan, at this point, once again, a health security condition factor. At what point would the Kohen Gadol be able to take the machta and the kaf and remove it with all its residue out of the Kodesh Kodashim? He has to clear it out of the Kodesh Kodashim, otherwise it'll sit there for a whole year. If he would do so when the mitzvah was fulfilled and it's Malei Kodesh Kodashim Kulei Oshan, then he would be endangering himself, because the gecholim are still hot at that point. We need time for the gecholim to cool off and for the embers of the Ketores to die down. So there's going to be a delay. We don't want a delay. Let the Kohen Gadol leave immediately when the mitzvah was fulfilled and the Kodesh Kodashim is filled with the smoke of the pillar of the Ketores, and not wait until he can remove the kafu machta. And he writes that he immediately exits from the Kodesh Kodashim, he comes into the Heichal, and he recites a tefillah. Again, we'll get to that later, exactly what his prayer is. And we don't want to delay this, because in Yishtaya, then he's Mavis es Yisrael. The people of Israel are in shock. Why didn't he come out? Where is he? Yusvarm Shemesham. Maybe he died there, which means that he's at Tztokim. The Tztokim were very frequently the Kohanim Gedolim during the Bayis Sheni. They bought the service, the office, with money. They bribed the king to appoint them, and they would Tztokim. They had a different method of doing Aktoris. And HaKadosh Baruch Hu goes in that they would die in the Kodesh Kadosh. They had to drag them out with a rope attached to the feet of the Kohen Gadol. So the people out there in the Heichal, well, there weren't that many people in the Heichal, but the Kohanim, they were anxiously awaiting for the exit of the Kohen Gadol to show himself up in the Heichal. And that would obviously prove that he did not perish. He was not at Stoke. So after the avod of the entire day is concerned, and the Kohen Gadol finally finished the day, he brought all the korbanos, and he brought the Talmud Shel Ben Arbayim. At that point, he would go again, enter into the Kodesh Kadosh. At this point, the embers of the Ketores and whatever Gecholim were left in the Mach had already cooled down, and he would be motzi the kaf and the machta that he had left in the Kodesh Kadosh. And this mitzvah, in which the Kohen Gadol enters for the last time into the Kodesh Kadoshim on Yom Kippur, is derived from the pasuk Uba Aaron el Oel Moed. This is pasuk of Gimel. Aaron comes into the Kodesh Kadoshim, the Oel Moed. Upashat is big day abad, and now he takes off his big day abad. What, inside the Kodesh Kadoshim? He's going to get undressed? It can't be. But rather, the Gemara darshans on Daf Lamed Beis, Lama Uba, what is he going to do when he comes into the Kodesh Kadoshim? He's not coming to undress himself, but rather Lahotzias HaKafes HaMachta. The Torah doesn't mention this explicitly, but by process of detective work, of elimination, we're going to have to assume that the reason he's going into the Kodesh Kadoshim now is because he left the Kafu Machta, that he's got to clear it out of the Kodesh Kadoshim. And then when he gets out, at that point, he's finished his avodah for the day. Now we can fulfill the mitzvah of Upashat as Big Abad, and he can do again a change in his garments. And this mitzvah of Uba Aaron el Moed is now being interpreted as the last entry into the Kodesh Kadoshim in order to remove the Kafu Mach. Now, the next topic of discussion, which I'm going to introduce now, and Paulinetta will pick it up after Pesach, and more likely on Monday after Pesach, because Yom Rishon, I'm going to be in transit from a lot of things going on in that Sunday morning. I'm up in near Etzion. Let's make it for Monday. And we're going to talk about the Hazos of the Damapar, which are also inside the Kodesh Kadoshim Ben Abad. And this is after the Aktoras Aktores. The Kohen had already shechted his par before he went into the Kodesh Kadoshim for the purpose of Ketores. So the Dam HaPar is already ready to go. And now the Kohen Gadol takes the Dam HaPar into the Kodesh Kadoshim, standing Ben Abadim. He dips his fingers on his right hand into the Dam HaPar, and he does 8 hazos. He sprinkles the dam 8 times. Achas l'mayla v'sheva l'mata. And all this is in the airspace of Ben Abad. Now you might ask me, as we asked yesterday, what about a Bayis Sheni? There was no Aron. It was Bigniza. So what's Bein Abadim? But they knew exactly where that location was in the Kodesh Kodoshim, and that's where he did the Azov, the Damapar, after the Aktoris Aktor. Makom Azov, so you can get Tefach, Sheb the Ovio Shala Kaporis. Ach lo ayu adamim nogim bekaporis atzma, ela noflim ala oretz. So the entire process of Azor would end up with the dam going down to the ground. It did not go onto the parochas itself. And I emphasize this because I saw one of the diagrams seem to indicate, if you don't see it clearly, that the dam went onto the parochas. Lo hayu adamim nogim bekaporis, ela noflim ala oretz. The alcohol azov azosh kohen gadol bazeh is haya tovel etzbo b'dam shu. So you could have interpreted it otherwise. You could have said that all he needs is to fill up his hands with dam after he's tovel the fingers in the dam, and then he just spritzes it. No. Every single one of the azos is a separate independent kiyum, a separate entity, and requires a new tfilas etzba. So it's tfilas etzba and this hazah. And hazah is in the airspace of Bein Abadim, and he's going to gradually go from a higher place to a lower place with different types of movement of his hand, where the hazah is with the kaf lamata or the kaf lamala, and this we're going to get into in Mirz Hashem after the Chag. So let's make a note that we got up to Azos Dam Par Bein Abad.